Yeah, Jesse and Dan, we are just in awe over here. When I woke up this morning and looked at the weather forecast, I was like, man, we're going to be back here on Sunday, but we did
We
it.
did
And
it.
the room cleared out. Everybody was outside watching, and inside the lights were shaking, the cameras were shaking. Lauren came back in with tears in her eyes. This is really amazing.
I, I can't believe it. I saw it with my own eyes. This is, I'm
Burns or firing of those Draco thrusters on Dragon that are going to bring it close to station, but majorly raise it. The next 19 hours, Dragon's going to execute a series of burns which will gradually raise its orbit to align more closely with the station. There are going to be 5 major burns or firing of those Draco thrusters on Dragon that are going to bring it close to station before we begin our final approach maneuvers. The first one is coming up in just a little bit, and it's the phase burn. Right now, teams are doing their go-no-go to get ready for that, and it's performed at the first apogee, or the highest point, of the initial orbit, and that's going to raise Dragon's perigee to a higher altitude.
And after a calculated time, which is based on what our orbital data shows us, the boost burn raises Dragon's orbit until it's just 10 kilometers lower than the space station, followed soon after by the close co-elliptic burn to place Dragon on orbit roughly co-elliptic with the space station. This means Bob and Doug will be about 10 kilometers lower than the station during their entire orbit around the Earth. The fourth maneuver is the transfer burn, where we raise Dragon's apogee, or highest point of its orbit, to just 2.5 kilometers below the station. And we round everything out with a final co-elliptic burn to once again maintain a constant orbit beneath station. It's just 2.5 kilometers below.
Then we get into the approach initiation and final stages of Dragon's rendezvous with the space station. This is also where we start what we call joint operations between the Dragon control team here in Hawthorne and the space station flight controllers in Mission Control Houston. The teams transition to those integrated ops roughly 45 minutes prior to approach initiation, which is another burn that really means Dragon's getting close. During the approach, SpaceX flight controllers work in tandem with the NASA team in Houston to activate and test out a number of systems on Dragon, including establishing bidirectional communications with the station using a system known as C2V2, which stands for Common Communications for Visiting Vehicles. They also set up a data stream from Dragon to the station, just giving another path for Dragon telemetry or data about its performance to come down to the ground and giving an additional command capability to astronauts on board the station. They'll also maneuver Dragon to the proper attitude and then initialize the navigation sensors used for that very slow and methodical approach to station.
At approximately 5:24 a.m. Pacific time, that's tomorrow morning, Draco thrusters on Dragon will fire for the approach initiation burn when Dragon is about 2.5 kilometers below station and just about 7 kilometers behind it. This will swing Dragon up until it is about 400 meters directly below the station, and this maneuver will also move Dragon inside one of those 2 safety zones around the station that requires a set of go-no-go pulls with the different control teams. The first zone is called the approach ellipsoid, which is an imaginary shape measuring about 4 kilometers by 2 kilometers by 2 kilometers, which is essentially a large 3-dimensional oval. Before Dragon is given permission to move inside the ellipsoid, referred to by the teams as the AE, it is configured to be on what is known as a 24-hour safe trajectory. This means that if Dragon lost all control...
Dragon, SpaceX for update.
If Dragon lost all control to its thrusters, it would be at least 24 hours before its
Go ahead, Jay.
trajectory would move inside the approach ellipsoid.
Okay, for suit doffing, we're still waiting for cabin to be below 25C and trending down. It looks like it's on the way there, but not quite. And the second item is during the burn, we may have intermittent comm and due to pointing, and this is expected.
We're just listening.
Okay, copy the cabin temp and suit doffing and the intermittent comm during the burn.
Good read back, and we are go for the phase burn. Looks like it's in about 12 minutes.
Dragon Dragon go for the phase burn.
We're just getting a couple of quick updates. They're still wearing those suits that they've been in since we saw them suit up in the O&C building several hours ago. Once temperature just comes down inside the cabin a little bit, they'll get to go to doff or just take their suits off. And you just heard we're less than 12 minutes now from that first burn called the phase burn. Getting back to where we're going to be tomorrow, though, once Dragon arrives at just 400 meters below the station, it's going to be what's known as Waypoint Zero, and that's the first checkpoint during our approach. The vehicle can hold at 400 meters, or it can continue on if all the systems check out, and then it'll begin the approach to Waypoint 1. By this point, the teams will do a go, no-go for Dragon to move inside the keep-out sphere. It's another one of those zones around the station, and it's an imaginary sphere with a radius of about 200 meters. It's just another chance to confirm all the guidance, navigation, and control systems are working correctly on Dragon before we move it in really close to station. And it carries a similar requirement to the AE that Jesse talked about, where if Dragon lost all control of its thrusters, it would not go inside of that sphere for at least 4 orbits or about 6 hours instead of the 24 hours for the approach ellipsoid.
Dragon's move from waypoint 0 to waypoint 1 will swing it up and out in front of the station, pausing at a distance of approximately 220 meters. At this point, it will be on what we call the docking axis, which essentially means it is directly in front of the docking port. Bob and Doug are headed to the forwardmost port of the International Space Station, the Node 2 forward port. That is where Dragon docked last year on the Demo 1 mission and where one of the 2 international docking adapters is located. These were installed for new commercial spacecraft 220 meters. At this point, it will be on what we call the docking axis, which essentially means it is directly in front of the docking port. Bob and Doug are headed to the forwardmost port of the International Space Station, the Node 2 forward port. That is where Dragon docked last year on the Demo 1 mission and where one of the 2 international docking adapters is located. These were installed for new commercial spacecraft flights and any other future spacecraft that also use the International Docking Standard.
Before moving into the final waypoint, the crew will execute their second manual flight test, except this time they'll be in what we call the near field. That just means they're close to the station. The crew will actually command a hold when they're 220 meters away from the station and conduct a series of maneuvers. So it'll be Doug and Bob at the controls. First, they'll fly Dragon to the center line of the docking approach, just precisely lining it up with that docking port. Then they'll do a number of translational maneuvers, so using the Draco thrusters on Dragon to move it around the different axes. And then they'll always be checking in with the ground on how much propellant is used. Again, translational is just you're moving back, forward, side to side. When we refer to attitude maneuvers, it's where you're pointing. But once they're complete with that, they'll transition control back over to the Dragon flight computer to resume that automated docking.
And once Dragon is only 20 meters away from waypoint 2, that the spacecraft focuses on aligning its docking system with the docking adapter. Dragon will then fly in and make contact with the IDA, giving us what we call a soft capture. The soft capture ring then retracts until sensors indicate it's time for hooks to drive in place to give us a hard capture and firmly secure Dragon to the station. Then it's time for leak checks and hatch opening, which is currently timelined to come about 2 hours following docking.
We're going to be here with you the entire way, and again, it's going to be a 2-team effort once Dragon gets really close. So why don't we jump over to Gary, International Space Houston. It's got to be exciting seeing that launch and knowing that they're on the way to you. How's the team doing, Gary?
Dan, there is allotment from the room. We are closely monitoring Dragon's few burns that are coming up here. You both did a great job of describing some of those. From the International Space Station side of things, we're really in a monitor mode for much of the flight. Once it gets closer to some of the docking portion of the flight that you were going through, that's when we'll start really kicking into gear for joint operations. Just when the Dragon is just about 80 kilometers away, we'll start doing our checkouts of a system called C2V2. That's the communication system. Dragon, through the most of its flight, will be talking or communicating with the TEIUNED satellites, the geosynchronous satellites around the Earth. Right about the 80 kilometer part, we'll be turning on the C2V2. That is the common communication for visiting vehicles and establishes a link between the International Space Station and Dragon. It'll be turned on for some S-band connections and testing some of the radio signals as Dragon makes its approach. Really, though, we'll be monitoring the approach through some of those final burns. Once it's in front of the International Space Station, the space station has a few things that it needs to do from the attitude control side of things to really prepare the station for docking, switching some of the thrusters over to the Russian side and really relying on those control moment gyros and the angular momentum there to keep the International Space Station nice and steady. Once it makes its approach, it'll really be up to Bob and Doug to perform those final maneuvers and into docking. Chris Cassidy, though, will be monitoring from the inside. He's got a tool called the RPOP, and he'll be monitoring the approach from the inside of the International Space Station. Chris Cassidy, through the past couple days, has been preparing the International Space Station for Bob and Doug, getting some of the beds that they'll be sleeping in on the International Space Station ready, really preparing some of the tools that he'll use for the monitoring, and then when Doug and Bob are nice and close to the International Space Station, opening up the hatch and getting some air right between the hatch where Bob and Doug will enter the International Space Station. Everything's still looking good from the space station side of things. We should be exiting a loss of communication now and going back and getting some views from station. Still having great views from Bob and Doug incrementally. We'll be following right along through the duration of this flight until it docks just 19 hours from now. That's it from us in here in Mission Control Houston. Dan, I'll send it back to you over in Hawthorne.
All right. Thank you, Gary. Now joining me here in Hawthorne, though, we'll get her a second to get mic'd up and everything, but SpaceX is
Aboard the International Space Station, Commander Chris Cassidy standing by in Node 2. Right in front of that is the pressurized mating adapter. He recently opened up the hatch to introduce some of the station air and mix it, get a nice mix in there, avoiding some CO2 pockets. That hatch you see just beyond Chris Cassidy.
This Dragon vehicle.
Monitor from this tool, again setting.
That's coming up in about, let's see here, giving Dragon a call, probably for that,
yeah, we have two of those.
with Doug on the last, not the last,
But a little trend back toward
Expedition 63 Commander Chris Cassidy in there, getting the hatchway open. You can see kind of at the very far end a space that looks like it kind of dips down and then goes to a small white hatch. That's the pressurized mating adapter. So that's the attachment point, really, along with the international docking adapter between Dragon and the International Space Station. So there's a small corridor. From now at about 5:09 a.m. Pacific, 12:09 GMT. So we'll stand by for one more burn. Again, we'll wait.
incredibly fast, especially when you put into perspective that most commercial airliners are around but like soft, comfy pajamas, but intentional. If you can see on your screen now, there's something called the Keep Out Sphere. That's a 200-meter radius imaginary sphere around the space station, and that's really to protect the crew both aboard the space station and the
15 minutes away from the start of this approach initiation burn. We are waiting to hear confirmation the crew is getting through their suit up steps, but moving closer to this approach initiation burn, it's going to be about a 90-second firing of the
Wow. Well, that is a very pretty view.
Yeah, getting a view of Dragon. We're coming up pretty soon on that approach initiation burn. Dragon itself is inside that 7.5 kilometer range that we're expecting it to be away from the space station before this starts.